Hey guys, welcome back. Today we head back into the annals of Warhammer to revisit a character that hasn't been seen for quite an age. So this is Dieter Helsnicht, the so-called Doom Lord of Middenheim, and he's a character who's made his appearances in many a White Dwarf battle report. He's kind of pretty much the poster character of the fourth edition army book for the undead, because this is a character who essentially gets his story sketched out in a White Dwarf battle report, and that's a fairly rare thing for these stories to actually make it into the final versions of the canon, so to speak. So Dieter Helsnicht is, at the time, the fourth edition undead army book basically allows you to explore a huge number of undead units and choices. Your undead units essentially are a grab bag of various tropes and very much of a D&D kind of approach to that mixed bag of undead creatures, and they kind of don't synergize too well, nor do they actually make thematic sense. But they all kind of find their way into this one army book, and it's a really interesting read, if only as far as you get to really see where a lot of the tropes of the undead armies over the years has really come from. Now, since fourth edition, which is I think the first and only time you see a combined undead army book, we've since moved on to the vampire counts, which is what they got in fifth edition, and then of course the Tomb Kings joined us a little bit later in sixth edition. So this is the one and only time that we get to see a unified army of the undead. Although I think maybe calling it unified may be a bit generous, considering that it's just a mix, a sort of whole entire like grab bag of like tropes and ideas that kind of get thrown together. Preceding this army book was actually the Ravening Hordes version, which simply had a bestiary that just described in quite a bit of detail actually all the different undead units and how they kind of function together loosely to create adversaries for your various armies to face up against. But yeah, so Dieter Helsnicht, I guess, in a book that allows you to play, vampire counts or vampire lords, as the case may be. You could be a necromancer lord. You could be a leech. You could have a mummy tomb king. With all these different character options, Dieter Helsnick basically represented the necromancer sort of path, and as such, really represents the kind of quintessential core of the list, because what I found was that the Lich appears to be more of a variant of the Necromancer path, and the Vampire likewise is a Necromancer with slightly different stats. And functionally, they were kind of the same, but the Necromancer really looks to be the core sort of mold from which the other two variants are derived. Make of that what you will. So in the Warhammer world, necromancers basically have a really hard life because they are constantly being pursued by the witch hunters of the Temple of Sigmar, as well as of Ulrich and any other number of human worship gods, all of which pretty much universally abhor any kind of dabbling with the living dead or resurrecting creatures unnaturally and so on. Necromancy is, to be fair, a kind of a dark offshoot of shadow magic, which sort of has kind of an ill reputation because of how close it gets to the concept of controlling free will and sort of infusing that will into various other creatures, or in the case of necromancers specifically, of bringing living creatures back to life. Yeah, so in short, stories involving the undead at this point in time in Warhammer's history have kind of a sort of secret war kind of element to them. People who are involved in necromancy generally are doing it kind of beneath the surface, trying to stay hidden from the witch hunters and the other religious authorities of the old world, and generally trying to avoid getting caught or even seen or noticed by members of the public. So there is a kind of real secret war kind of feel to the way necromancers survive. And necromancers essentially all live a double life. In the beginning, they may be more reputable characters, even personages with wealth or power or ambition, or all of the above. And then essentially they sort of go down the path of resurrecting creatures, and that basically lands them in trouble with the Church of Moor and so on and so forth. And down that whole path madness lies, because eventually, a few times you run away from the Church of Sigma, and for some reason they send more witch hunters to pursue you, and then before long they're rebel rousing an entire population into a frenzy and chasing you down, and so called and so on and so forth. So the Doom Lord of Middenheim, the Helsnicht, his story more or less follows these beats. He begins in plain, I guess, in the open, I suppose, just a strange noble with bizarre tastes, and then eventually his stronghold, or his manor, uh, essentially he gets burned out of his home essentially by the witch hunters, and he leaves on his manticore, which is an interesting concept in and of itself, because this guy was so eccentric, so rich, and so, I guess, isolationist, that he managed to secret a manticore, which is not traditionally a quiet beast, into his manor, and then he manages to leave on said creature into the night, swearing revenge, yada yada yada. A very Warhammer Undead story in that sense. He then comes back, to lay siege to the town of Beeckerhoven, and there needs to be an alliance of three Empire armies to come to kind of sort him out and to chase him away. But he does manage to do his best to evade capture, and he comes back and remains dangerous and quite willing to threaten the world again once he's built up his power, of course. So yeah, Undead at this time, very much a shadow force operating in the darkness, and every now and then when you have a sudden sort of upwelling of undead, it usually tends to be because there is some kind of surge in sorry, I guess it would be not man sleep, more sleep, right? The evil moon, that other half of men sleep and more sleep, right? So the dark moon that rises when the power of dark magic is kind of on the rise, because that's just the Warhammer world for you, right? Essentially, it's very much a world where there is a gate from which pours in energy from another alternate realm, right? Kind of like 40k and the Warp and so on, but the Warhammer version before 40k was a thing. So yeah, essentially, when there is the rise of more sleep, that's when essentially you've got a lot more dark magic extant in the world, and therefore undead creatures prove a lot easier to raise and control by the necromancers, and essentially they have a big glut of power, which they inevitably use to kind of sort out their grievances with the living. Because when you've been persecuted for a long time, I would imagine, yeah, you will want some revenge at some point. So that's our boy, the Helsnicht, who essentially summons a huge horde of undead, and then goes to Beeckerhoven to lay siege, where he's opposed by the Counts of Middenland and Nordland, I think, as well as a sizable Kislevite contingent, and then this god awful like assemblage of chaotic armies essentially crashes against the defenders of the town, who are human, yeah, 100% human actually, and eventually the Doomlord gets driven off, as so often evil villains do, in order to preserve the setting. But yeah, there you go. Kind of a cool story, kind of a little bit tropey, but pretty enjoyable nonetheless. So back to the model. Okay, I have put on a little bit of red because this model has quite an interesting color scheme in the official fourth edition army book. Yeah, he's got more or less a traditional dark color scheme, but he does feature a sizable amount of red, because and this might be coincidental, but there is a little bit of an element of chaos to this guy. He does carry the Chaos Rune Sword, which is that sort of blade that you have on the right side with the red runes that I painted in already. So, for whatever reason, or maybe it's just because he was just a product of the time. To be fair, a lot of models were, had this sort of a color scheme. I do find that at this point, because the heavy metal team was really whoever they had working on at the time, and the size of the team is sometimes variable and not always up to the task or the size of the task in creating armies for White Dwarf and so on. That very often armies involved just everybody coming together to paint a few models in order to contribute to the cause. You do find that a lot of these miniatures actually have quite a bit of black in their color scheme, and it's my conspiracy theory that they started with a black undercoat and then they kind of went in and added other colors over it. And if they ran out of time, well, then those parts will simply stay black. Simple, really. Okay, we're going to move on to Dieter's legs. And, on closer inspection, I've just realized that he is not, in fact, wearing black. He's wearing purple. I think it's just an artifact of the way like photos were ultra processed at this point. And of course, the original resolution wasn't the greatest, and the light was variable and some such. But it really looked like black to me. In fact, it is kind of a really dark purple, kind of like Nagash actually. I'm noticing that there is actually a surprising amount of purple in a lot of these earlier models, as well as a lot of bright colors, which is kind of wonderful to behold. So with that in mind, I am going to keep the black base coat that I did with the contrast paint because I kind of like the way it looks. I think it's a really good base to work from. But maybe what I'll do is I'll try to work in a little bit of purple into the highlights, so we get an intensely dark purple instead, and fairly desaturated and maybe not too gaudy looking. I think that sounds pretty good to me. Cool. So I am finishing up the areas of black that I'm painting on, and then we can very shortly move on to work in some of the silver. Aha! Hang on a second. There are these funny little windows on either side of his head, and there are these weird structures as well. I'm gonna need a little bit more black actually. Yeah. So one of the things about miniatures at this time is I feel like every available bit of space sometimes has little bits of detail added in, and it's pretty wonderful to look at. So that's actually a pair of scythes fringing either side of his head. So yeah, kind of awesome, really. But it really does harken back to the law of shadows, because the scythe is a symbol of the College of Shadows, and I don't think the law says anything about where Dieter Helsnicht first started studying magic, but I don't believe he began as a college wizard yet. He's got a pair of these symbols on either side of his cowl, and those are kind of an interesting nod to the Amethyst, or yeah, Law of Shadows essentially, Amethyst College. So yeah, make of that what you will, I suppose. In addition, he's got this really cool kind of Magneto-looking helmet. No real idea why this might be. I guess it just makes him look very wizardly. I think this is a product of the Gary Gygax sort of school of wizard design, so to speak. Because yeah, you do get this in many artworks from D&D, which were of course themselves inspired by the work of Rosetta and so on. So these influences do combine in many Warhammer models because they are inevitably nerds like the rest of us. And they do wear their inspiration on their sleeve sometimes, which is often, for the betterment of the miniatures being produced, just so long as they didn't get sued. But at the time, I think there was a little bit less of that stuff going on. People were a little bit less litigious in general, so maybe the IP infringement sort of went unnoticed, or really rather, it wasn't defined enough to constitute any kind of an IP breach. But yeah, there you go. So a little bit more red. We'll go on this sort of gemstone on his sword. It's an interesting sort of roundish gemstone. Getting a bit more red. This guy does seem to be a bit paint hungry. It's like soaking up the little droplets that I'm putting on my wet palette. But that's just fine. He is the Doom Lord of Midtone after all. And he does deserve all the time and effort to make him look as cool as he did in the old days. So this model was a combination of Gary Morley for the Rider and Trish Morrison for the Manticore, both of which are fairly good period examples of the sculpting styles of the people responsible. Gary Morley at this point has an interesting approach to clothing. I think he imbues a lot of the clothing that he sculpts on his miniatures with a lot of motion. I think part of me wants to be generous and say that it's really down to referencing the idea that undead is an animating force, and therefore there's a lot of motion in the clothing. The other half of it is just, I think, the idea that when you sculpt with green stuff, it's got the consistency of chewing gum, so you tend to pull and push it a lot, and that means it's very easy to sort of let the sort of flows and bends in the fabric to get kind of a little bit out of hand. So I'm sure it's probably a little bit of both, because I've never quite seen Gary Morley's sculpting get quite so flamboyant with the folds and creases as he does with the undead. Everything else that he sculpts later on, for example, a lot of the Wood Elf range and a lot of Blood Bowl miniatures don't have anything like this level of floweriness. Even though, yes, generally speaking, Blood Bowl models do have a lot less fabric as a whole. What fabric that they do have doesn't have this kind of expressive movement. But yeah, maybe that's just how it is, yeah? Cool. We are going to jump into and add a little bit of silver now. There is a surprising amount of silver on this model on the period color scheme, and that includes these like sort of bat-winged horns on either side of the Staff of Flaming Death. That's this wonderful device over here with the giant red skull in the center. So this essentially was a wand that could project basically a fireball, but it was just D3 strength 4, I believe, 24-inch range, that kind of thing. And it was just a bounce spell that kind of augmented his ability to deal damage at range, which is very useful because Dieter Helsnicht, despite having an amazing stat line, Necromancers back in the day in 4th edition had tremendous stat lines, because they would not only be very proficient from fighting witch hunters and a life of persecution, but it'd also be using all sorts of like dark magic means to augment their own physiques and their own personal chances of survival. So unbelievably, this Necromancer Lord, has 5 attacks base at a strength of 4. At a strength of 5, actually. 5 attacks at strength 5, and he's got weapon skill 7, which is just for anyone who played Warhammer later on, that's just unheard of, isn't it? Yeah, so this guy had a heroic stat line, akin almost to a Chaos character. And they were absolutely terrifying to fight on the battlefield. I guess the one thing that they didn't have was availability of armor, because being wizards, necromancers had a tendency to be disallowed wearing armor, because the prevailing design philosophy was that it interfered with your ability to cast spells. That's quite opposed to what we have now in Age of Sigmar, where everybody casts spells in armor. Quite a different thing, but yeah, there you go. These rules do change. What's canon and what's not do change over the years, and inevitably they evolve into something quite different given enough time. So yeah, Dieter could fight, he could cast spells, and he had that staff. And what I'm painting now, which is the Chaos Rune Sword, and the Chaos Rune Sword is a purely offensive magic item. It simply gives him +1 strength and +1 attacks. So hang on, that means this guy has a strength of 6, and he's got 6 attacks. Meaning, at this point, he'll out wrestle a Minotaur. And he's just mounted on a Manticore as well, right? That's no slouch in combat. So the problem with this guy, I suppose, was that he was a complete package, and he really paid a lot of points for it. With everything added in, he's well over 600 points. At a point when Nagash was 700, that really says a lot, because Nagash, we know, is pretty costly for what he does. And this guy was no slouch in the cost department either. He was getting up there in terms of points. But he was a very cool model, and he did have that battle report, sort of experience. In retrospect, I think he only appeared in one battle report, and even then, I'm not sure whether it was published in White Dwarf or it was in the Warhammer Armies Undead book itself. I do believe there is a version of it in Warhammer Armies Undead, but the layout and just the way it's presented looks very much like a White Dwarf battle report. So I cannot confirm whether it appeared in White Dwarf as well, but it certainly looks like it did, and it's a really great read. If you can track it down, I highly recommend you look it up and have a read. Very, very good fun indeed. Yeah. So lots of silver areas, many of which I will eventually glaze to turn into silver. Turn into gold. Sorry. So yeah, just making sure that I cover all these spots. His banner. In case you're wondering why I have his banner on, why did I not leave it separate? So that I could paint it separately. It's because his banner is actually attached to his legs. So no, you cannot keep his banner separate. Even though that would certainly make things a lot more convenient for the purposes of actually painting a paper banner or attaching a paper banner. I don't believe there was a sticker for this one. Yes, some of the earlier characters had stickers, essentially. Decals that you could use to, well, they were stickers. They were backed decals, so those would be your banners actually. But this guy didn't have that, unfortunately. So we're going to have to paint something for him. And yes, I do love the process of painting paper banners. Something very, very satisfying and very retro about it. So not to worry, I will get into that. So yeah, let me just go ahead and work in all the last of the silver, and that will help me decide which bits are going to be gold as well. Quite a bit of coverage on this guy actually, because he's got a gigantic sort of barbarians kind of belt, which is just very on trend for miniatures of this era. And he's got interesting things on his shoes as well as his essentially metal like boot holders to help him sit astride. His mount, he does have these armored sort of leggings, so I'll do these in silver as well. And yeah, he should be coming along quite nicely indeed. Yeah. Gary Molly's models, man, they're a lot of fun to paint. The detail is usually nice and clear, and his clothing is extremely dramatic and fun to paint, in particular these early undead models. So if you can get a chance to sort of track down some of these miniatures to have a go yourself, I highly recommend it. They are good fun to paint, and unlike other examples of miniatures that might be a little bit fuzzy in terms of detail, Gary Morley's sharpness and his ability to render detail clear and readable, very, very appealing indeed. If you've had a lot of muddy details to deal with lately, this model is just a dream to work on. Yep. So, adding more silver to the skull over here, he does have quite a bit of decoration on him, quite a bit of bling actually, as befits a character of his status. This model, I believe, shares the master, the form of another mounted necromancer with a very similar pose, but he's got most of his details added and created from scratch. So he looks quite different from the other guy. We will be painting the other necromancer as well, simply because he's going to be good fun to paint, and I really like these Gary Morley sculpts. So yeah, you're going to have to bear with me then. because we're going to be painting Dieter for quite a while. He's got quite a lot going on, so that might take us a little bit longer to do, but that's just fine. Right, so it's time to jump in and do some of his flesh. So I'm going to use the standard human skin tone because I want him to look like a living creature at this point. Later on, necromancers receive the undead rule as well, if only just to make sure that everybody functioned the same. But in 4th edition, it was kind of important to know who was alive and who was not, who could flee and who would essentially crumble to dust if they were to either lose combat or lose additional models as a result of losing combat, which were all variations of rules, all residing within the same army book. So you had models like Dieter himself and his Manticore, both of which were very much alive, and as a result, if Dieter lost combat, he would actually flee, just like anybody else, or potentially flee. He did have a very high leadership of 10 because, one apparently gets quite inured to terrors of the world when you're pursued by witch hunters all day, but there you go. It was actually possible for him to run, even though he was immune to fear. Yeah, so Dieter Helsnicht, quite the character, but for the most part still human, which is why we're going with this skin tone. So both hands fairly large and well defined. You can clearly see the digits, and yeah, slightly unfortunate that he's got the sort of static arms akimbo kind of pose, but in retrospect I can see that it was done because they were trying to keep the part count low. The upper body with both weapons, right, sort of spread out left and right, are one piece. And then the lower body, the lower legs, like I mentioned, are one piece together with the back banner. And then there's a top half to the back banner that attaches to it as well. So yeah, low part count, fairly easy to assemble. And his Manticore follows in a similar vein as well because it's comprised of fewer parts than you would expect. Obviously, the wings are separate, but for the most part, they are just two body halves and the head, and then one or two legs are separate. No, they're not, actually. Now that I think about it, the body is just two halves. Yeah, so it's a fairly straightforward miniature to assemble, and the result, I think, will be quite spectacular eventually. Cool. So that's the flesh blocked in. His staff has blue details on it, which is not the kind of color I think you would expect to see on many undead models, but it's the design of the times, so we are going to stick with that. So I'm using Ultramarines blue contrast paint because it's got kind of a blue jean sort of color, more indigo really, so not quite so vibrant and saturated, kind of suitable for an undead model because it is ever so slightly darker and more sinister looking. Cool. Right, so that's his staff, looking alright. Maybe just a little bit more intensity. Ultramarines blue does get very, very intense though, so you do need to monitor how much water gets into it so that you can keep it sort of readable and not overwhelming the surface of the model. Just a bit of a touch up with the black before we go on into doing like silver and so on. Now, the next thing we want to do is to grab a little bit of Skeleton Horde and put that onto his shoulder pads because they are in fact covered in little skulls. Which is just what you do, right? If you're a necromancer, if you had any choice of deco on your outfit, you would use little skulls, wouldn't you? It's just, kind of rude not to have an homage to the source of your power. And then the other side. And really all of his back banner as well, because that is probably the spine of some long dead creature. Oh yes, the two sides, oddly enough, were done in bone as well. And I'm not sure whether it's because the painter kind of disregarded the fact that these are probably gilded details or something, but we will follow suit because it doesn't look bad at all. In fact, it kind of makes it less obvious that you have the chains and the scythe, so it keeps everything nice and subtle, which I don't mind at all, frankly. Okay, so let's move on to highlighting his cloth then. I am going to grab some form of purple. Pardon me for a second as I reach over, because like I mentioned, I did not plan this beforehand. Uh, cool. So we're going to grab a bit of Luxion purple, and we're going to mix a rudimentary highlight out of this. It's a pretty tight bottle. Sorry about that. Okay, and then into this, we're going to mix some of our Vallejo Silver Grey, and this gives us a really nice intense highlight, which we're going to apply judiciously. Probably a bit of black as well. Black Templar that was lying on the palette. And let's see how this turns out. There we go. That's actually a pretty good analog for the official color scheme. Yeah. Kind of a nice deep desaturated purple. Not too over the top. Although clearly this shows his flamboyance and wealth. Because Dieter is a man of means. And in between fleeing from witch hunters, he has accrued quite an empire around him. I mean, the man has a manticore, which I assume must have been traded from, like, animal trappers in the north, maybe Norscan people, or elsewhere in the Warhammer world. He's a man of means to be able to keep something like that in his menagerie, his private zoo, in his stronghold in the Shadow Forts. Shadow Fortress? Shadowlands, something like that. And yeah, they never named his manticore though, which is a little bit unfortunate. So, because that manticore is one of the most iconic miniatures, it's just like A plus derp. So it's a bit unfortunate that we don't actually have a name to accompany that amazing face. I will be painting that in another session because I'm not sure how far I can get on this guy, but I decided to just make a start because this model, well, frankly, I couldn't wait any longer because I really wanted to paint this guy. Yeah, so this is a guy again from my childhood. A lot of these miniatures were really quite important to me growing up, and I was actually really excited about painting him until I realized quite how dated he was. And basically, a lot of better releases got released, and that's just how it is when you're young and you don't have the discipline, I suppose, or just the vision to appreciate the quirkiness of earlier miniatures. You kind of always want to just chase after the newest thing, the newest, most exciting thing. And it's only later in life that, just how cute and derpy these models are kind of hits you, and you really want to make a collection out of them. So unfortunately, I sold off many models from back in the day, or I never cared for them as much as they deserved, and I lost a lot of these parts. Kind of unfortunate, really, but that's just how it is. I'm just happy I can do something about it today. And I'm glad you're here with me watching me paint this very satisfying miniature in a color that would make the heavy metal painters of the day proud, such as they were. Because this is indeed their color scheme. So yeah, purple. This is the undeadiest color of the time. I believe at this point almost no other faction used purple. So it was kind of perfect that they had their own faction color to help them stand up amongst the enemies of the good guy races like your dwarves and your empire and so on. So we're adding more silver gray to raise up the Luxion purple further. And I think we can keep the highlights very sharp and rarefied, because I think the biggest sin that you can commit while highlighting Gary Morley's work is to sort of make the highlights fat and undefined. You actually want to make it super sharp, because that really works well with his more expressive, kind of thicker style of sculpting, and it sort of sharpens the points. Actually, if you look closely at Gary Morley's work, his edges are very defined, and they taper beautifully, as well as they have a bit of a lip to any of the hard edges that you will want to highlight properly. But I think these often get overlooked because it takes a certain amount of awareness to try to make sure that these edges are nice and defined, and not just sort of fat and noodly, as might be our natural inclination when looking at the geometry that he presents on his miniatures. So yeah, a little bit of care goes a long way, and I think with a bit of effort they can look extremely nice, actually, and very detailed and very, very pretty. Yes, most pretty. There we go. So purple suit, kind of like jokery, is looking good. And then from this point on, I think what we want to do is to add a little bit more definition to his face. So I'm adding a bit of AK light flesh to our flesh mix of Guilliman Flesh and Seraphim Sepia. I'm not sure if I mentioned it earlier, but yeah, it's Guilliman Flesh and Seraphim Sepia contrast paint over our Pylox grey-white undercoat. Really simple, really. In one coat, you get most of the colors that you need, and then from this point on, it's just a case of adding highlights to bring definition to his rather craggy face. Which in my opinion is not a bad thing, because the definition really suits the look of the model, in my opinion. Then onto the knuckles, front and back, and we'll come in to do his nails in a little bit. As well as his finger bones, as we've done many times before. I do actually like the amount of expression Gary Morley gets into his faces, because they have quite quintessential Saturday morning cartoon villain grins. It does deter, and that's pretty cool. Okay, so we're going to jump in and start to detail some of the silver by either staining it with gold. Now this is my mix of Nazdreg yellow plus Seraphim Sepia shade. As you can see, with one coat, we're beginning to get a bit of a facsimile of gold paint that we can then go on to add additional shading or highlighting as needed. But it gives us a really good base to work from and a more readable kind of finish. So that's his saddle piece, in case you're wondering why he's got this big chunky thing near his crotch. And then the Chaos Rune sword has its hilt that we want to flesh out in gold as well, being careful not to cover any of our earlier work with the red gemstone. Not that it should really interfere too much, but you do want to sort of deaden the vibrancy of that red. And the underside of the hilt, it's got a pair of kind of like almost like bird wings. Quite interesting design. Certainly something that you don't really see very much with later designs, because Gary Morley soon changes his style to be a little bit more like Jazz Goodwin, I suppose, which I guess was better received back in the day. But I actually really liked these models, even if they were a little bit of their time. and frankly a little bit on the small side. But it's good to remember essentially how old these miniatures are, because yeah, the Doom Lord hasn't been resurrected since, unfortunately. This story has kind of passed on into legend, and maybe that's okay. Now his pommel on his blade, which can look nice and bright and opulent, and his staff is kind of, well, frankly, it's going to be mostly silver for some bizarre reason in the original artwork, which we will honor today because I like the idea of these, having the same color scheme as what I remember in my childhood. And sometimes when I repaint these models, I discover that they don't quite match what I remember, but that's kind of cool in its own way. So I want to sort of keep that going. Gold for this skull. Unfortunately, I have no idea what his saddle sort of thingy, what color it's supposed to be, because that was quite out of the frame of any photos that were taken of this model at the time. So I'm just giving it my best guess, really. But I think that's fine. I think gold is a reasonable choice, and frankly, this entire front part of his crotch will be effectively invisible because all that gets hidden by his manticle's head, and his manticle has like really massive, like shaggy hair, and all of this is kind of invisible anyway once you put that on. So I'm gonna drop on Noun Oil all over his boots and his riding stirrups, as well as the back, where he's got the continuation of the armor plate from the front. And I'm keeping his actual pants black because I think that just looks better. He's got a little bit of that kind of witchy, warlocky kind of look anyway. So these colors suit him just fine to keep these dark. And yeah, this goes over his staff. This is Noun Oil, by the way. I use Noun Oil because I think it gives the best slightly stained effect. I realized that the new Noun Oil that you can get, or the current Noun Oil that you can get in Games Workshop stores, is a slightly different formula. It doesn't stain quite as much. But truthfully, if you were to put just a little bit of, say, Black Legion or Black Templar into it, you essentially get the same color as the Noun Oil that everybody from this era sort of knew and loved. So yeah, I invite you to give that a shot if you feel that the new Noun Oil doesn't quite do what you want it to do. So you can see that there is a little bit of staining as I apply this, but with a little bit of brush control, you can make sure that the staining stays wherever you want it to go, and instead of just going sploosh everywhere. I am actually really looking forward to doing the banner on this miniature. I do find the banners extremely fun to paint. They are a bit of a lost art with more recent miniatures, but I think the practice with freehand is very entertaining and quite diverting from the usual humdrum of painting miniatures, or at least the usual kind of things that you would do. His icon on his forehead was oddly silver as well. I would have expected, gold to be the more obvious choice since it's directly over his head, but there you go. And this is part of the reason why I have that theory about a lot of these paint jobs being incomplete, because of schedules. Because every now and then you see something that clearly would look better in gold or look more appropriate in gold, but it's painted silver instead, or else there's a section of black on the miniature that isn't actually highlighted at all, and it's just sort of the original undercoat, not treated beyond that at any point. But that's how it is sometimes. Not a lot to be done about it, at least not now, years and years later, other than to try to finish the work that artist started so long ago and to paint them to our own satisfaction. So a particular example of that would be the Lamassu rider for the Chaos Dwarfs. I find that there is a lot of unpainted black or unfinished black areas, on that miniature. Not least because, as a Lamasu, a lot of the model is black, that is true. But also a lot of the helmet details or a lot of the hat details of that Chaos Dwarf Sorcerer Rider, a lot of it is unfinished as well. Just appears to be black. Either that, or as in the case with the miniatures of the pictures of this miniature, the saturation has somehow darkened it to the point where everything appears unfinished. I honestly doubt that's the case. Anyway, so we are going on to apply more silver, and as a necromancer, he has an appropriate number of skulls all over his person because that's just what you do. You wear your career wherever you go, even when out of the workplace, and likewise, Dieter's quite the necromancer, quite the career necromancer, quite proficient in his particular job, and you can sort of see the accoutrement of his chosen profession in every square inch of the man. And it's kind of cool. Really like that, actually. How many strange little details that you might find. So he does have a little pouchy pouch over there on his left side, which I think I will come back in to do in a more appropriate color. But I think he's come to a fairly good place. I think what we want to do is to maybe just make sure that the gold has the intensity that it needs to look great. Catch some of the areas behind, because there are a lot of hidden crevices on this model as a result of that back banner, that giant back banner that you're forced to have on. But there you go, such as it is. Okay, so now I want to come back in with a little bit of silver to do some highlights, just to make sure that everything looks nice and bright and gleaming where it's appropriate. So the business end of his sword, his Chaos Rune sword, for example, as well as the top of his staff. Just painting a bit of silver along the edges of his weapon to kind of define it, make it look sharp and ready and dangerous. I'm going to do this on both sides. This blade, as well as on the rear. Blend in a little bit of this onto his staff head, while keeping the part that directly adjoins with the red skull darker. So we're coming in with a little bit more non-oil to address this attachment point. Okay, I think he's looking decent. Now we're going to darken the eye sockets of his skull, or rather his skull staff. And while we're here, we might as well grab a bit of Black Templar to paint in his nails. On both hands. Like so. Then grab a bit more silver and flesh out that skull on his chest. The one that sits on top of his golden belt. Might have made him a touch too opulent now that I look at him. But it's fine. He can carry it off. Because this guy is, if nothing, incredibly flamboyant. I mean, anybody who essentially has a manticore, a flying winged lion in his basement, kind of has the demeanor of a Bond villain anyway. And that's kind of awesome. Okay, I'm going to drop some probably gold renter fur onto that pouch to finish that off. So that's going to go here. Gives it a really nice dark mahogany brown to contrast well with the purple. Like so. And then maybe we'll keep some of this gold grunter fur to define the gold around his medallion as well as his skull decorations. Because gold grunter fur is really on that spectrum of fleshy reddish browns, you can use that to define the gaps between his fingers as well, just to make sure that he looks nice and clearly detailed. There we go. Okay. Hey guys, some time has passed because real life happens, so we are moving back into our highlights with a gusto. Because, to be honest, just like in real life, all that really matters is that we get back on the horse as quickly as we can after a setback. So, this is a mix of Luxion purple, black Templar, as well as white to create a highlight for Dieter's robes. As you might recall, the robes were originally painted black Templar because I thought it was going to be black. Turns out it was purple, and I mixed Luxion purple into the black to create sort of a rough highlight, which is why we are in this weird predicament. But as far as desaturated purples go, I quite like the way this looks, and I might use this recipe. It does bear resemblance to what we previously used for Nagash, and Nagash is Dieter's boss, so maybe they, shop at the same outlet store. That might be how, you maintain a unified front for the undead. I mean, considering their army list, something like that would certainly help. Cool. So, a little bit more highlighting, and I think he should be nicely spruced up. So far, the danger with using purples is that as colors go, they're not the strongest visually. So you do find that you may need to go quite heavy on the highlighting in order to get a visually attractive result. But the danger is that if you go too strong on the flip side, you might get something that kind of lacks punch. So maintaining that saturation level is kind of key. And the way we do this is by minimizing the amount of gray appearing in the highlight mix. In our case, the black and white mix gray. So I'm being careful to not overdo this. Just only on the very highest points and covering a very small surface area, for fear that the whole section will kind of look desaturated and featureless. So a little bit more of this just on the very edges and we're ready to go. If you're wondering why I put so much emphasis on highlighting these ends, it's because these are the only real parts of Dieter that will be visible in the final model, because a lot of his front actually gets covered up by his mount. So we want to make sure that the bits that are visible are well highlighted so that they pop up from his crazy chaos creature of a mount. So yeah, cool. So that's it for his clothing. I'm going to jump over to working some highlights into his red. And for this, I'm basically using Vallejo Light Orange. Just a slightly different method from the way I usually do this. But the Vallejo color does give a good basis for warmth, for a warm finish for this red mix. So we're putting our usual red mix, which is our Blood Angels orange, Blood Angels red, and Gryphhound orange. And we're just going to apply this on all of your typical highlight areas for skulls and such. For his skull staff, mixing in a little bit orange just to try to punch through that very strong, rich pigment. And yeah, there we go. So putting it on the apex of his forehead, the tops of his cheekbones, his teeth, and his lower jaw. Like so. And we're gonna go on and keep this nice and bright and apply this a little bit on his shoulder pads, his amazing shoulder pads, I might add, which are full of skulls, absolutely just bursting with skulls. Cleaning up a little bit of overspill over there from the orange, and then a little bit of orange on the runes for his Chaos Rune Sword. I feel like in this edition, the boundaries between Chaos and the other kind of anti-social faction, shall we call them, Undead, Skaven, and all of the other sort of evil races that pose a threat to the humans and elves and dwarves. I feel like the boundary between Chaos and the others was a lot narrower at this point, insofar as Chaos was more or less in league, if not directly, then in like tacitly with all of the other evil factions, and they pose more of a unified front against the good guys at this point, the forces of civilization and order. So the idea of an undead wizard wielding essentially a chaos rune sword, as Dieter does, didn't really sort of make a difference. It was actually fairly common for most of the evil factions to have access to chaos magic items, or at least those which are overtly possessed by malign entities, as was the case in 4th edition. In particular, the Chaos Dwarves, I mean, it's right in the faction's name, right? The Chaos Dwarves had a great many chaos magic items because they were, in fact, Chaos Dwarves. Okay, so just making sure his outfit is nice and showy, because our boy Dieter knows how to dress to impress, before jumping off into a little bit more white. Whoops, a bit more white to build up the highlights on his scythe, details on his cowl, going down both sides. I think it's hilarious that he has a pair of scythes going on. It's just the most showy thing there is. And then let's just do a few quick dabs of white, keeping the brush relatively dry with very little pigment. Just a few quick dabs to bring out some of the details of the skull. If I'm to be honest, the way these are sculpted, they kind of look a little like mushrooms, and I kind of love that. Mushrooms, I mean, not skulls. So, there we go. Okay, so that's gotten us a little bit more contrast, and I think Dieter's looking splendid. The last thing I wanted to do was to fix a little bit of his staff. I think Ultramarine's blue turned out to be a little bit more desaturated than I would have hoped. So I think the solution is to punch up the highlights a little bit more to ensure that you can really see the details over here. So a little bit more light speckling, and that really allows us to appreciate all that delicate engraving on the staff section, on the, well, stick section of the skull staff, sorry. He's got wielding over here. Okay, so looking pretty good if I did say so myself. Now we want to go on to mix our favorite ancient bone mix, because it's come time to do his back banner. And just looking at it, I think a combination of both regular bone as well as what we like to call ancient bone on this channel would help. So let's do that over here with ancient bone. So this is a 50-50 mix of Gryphcharger Grey and Skeleton Horde for the spine part of the saddle. And I think for the giant skull over the top, that would look best in Skeleton Horde straight. Now, as I mentioned previously, unfortunately, a lot of this gets hidden underneath the gigantic banner that we'll be preparing for Dieter. But, you know, I don't like the idea of our boy going to battle anything other than well-dressed. So we're going to do this the old-fashioned way and make sure that it comes out looking as wonderfully gaudy as can be, because that's Dieter's personality, an unusually flamboyant necromancer. So this kind of goes up over here over the sides, and then he's got a number of amulets dangling from a chain. Those we will pick out in silver in order to make sure that they stand out nice and bright. Okay, so just making sure that we get all of the recesses. So the reason why this is so rigid is it's actually part of his saddle, really. I know the fact that it's made out of like spine bones might pose an issue with flexibility, but that's okay. I'm sure he's figured it out. So we go on to Skeleton Horde, and this goes neatly, sits neatly over the skull. And then there's the cross piece, which at this point should surprise no one, that is actually made out of a giant femur. So let's just make sure that we get it all covered nice and neatly over the sides. And then we'll double back to make sure that we do the lower jaw as well for the skull. Alright, now you can really see the difference between the Skeleton Horde and what we call Ancient Bone on this channel. That's the bit that I've done in the spine for your reference. And just the fact that it looks so desaturated and cold rather than warm gives us a lovely contrast between the two kinds of bone that we're going to have for his back banner. So continuing onto this side, I'm gonna steal a little bit of pigment from the eye sockets where it's kind of pulled up a lot. and then block in a little bit over the ends of these giant femurs, so that when it comes time for us to add our highlights, these areas appear well shaded and well recessed. A little bit more Skeleton Horde. Now if you notice, I've actually got Dieter mounted on a invice, and the reason is because he's got a little section of wire going up the butt, and that's really going to help me in removing him during gameplay in the event he gets unhorsed from his manticore, or else if I decide to have some other rider for the manticore. During 4th edition, frankly, a lot of creatures were universal, a lot of mounts were universal, so you could have practically any character ride any mount. You could have, say for example, a necromancer lord riding a gigantic spider if you wanted, even though that's typically more associated with like forest goblins or goblins basically. These days, back in 4th edition, it really was up to you what mount you wanted to give your rider. So long as you could represent it with a miniature, that was perfectly okay. So with that in mind, I'm going to keep Dieter's manticore open to further collaborations with other evil beings in the future, and keep his options open. I'm going to grab a little bit of ice yellow to put some lights into the eyes of his skull of flaming death, staff of flaming death. And he looks suitably evil. And I'm going to match that on Dieter himself, who, it must be said, is looking like he needs a bit of sleep. So it's a tough life being a necromancer. You spend a lot of time running away from the witch hunters and abandoning lair after lair, only to plot your revenge. But plot Dieter did. And when he finally launched his attack on Beeckerhoven, he made a real mess of the Empire and its defenders. So let's go back in with a little bit more silver for highlights and edge the top part of the Staff of Flaming Death, and clean up some of the highlights on the side of this blade. His Chaos Rune Sword. The Chaos Rune Sword really was an unusual choice for Dieter, because it kind of makes him a bit of a combat monster, which is not really where you want to be with your average Necromancer Lord. Generally speaking, they were best served by not being in combat. But the Chaos Rune Sword made it so that I guess he could defend himself fairly well in the event that he needed to do so. Okay, I'm going to hit this with a hairdryer, back in a bit. Okay, with the bone nice and dry, we're going to come in with our highlights. This is dark sand, lightened with a little bit of white, making it light sand, I guess. Yeah, so I'm going to put this covering most of the areas that we want to keep in a light sand color for bone, while maintaining some of the striations that give bone that interesting streaky quality. And then we're coming in to detail the skull. Working on his teeth, lower jaw, and the ends of the femurs. I gotta say, the sheer length of this model Like because of this back banner, making it slightly difficult for me to reach every part of the model and keep it in frame. So I hope it's looking okay, and I'll do my best to press on to keep rotating the angle so I can reach everything in front of you. I think I'll find a better solution for working with models that have such a huge back banner in future. But trust me, I think it's going to be worth it once we actually do the banner proper. I think this guy will be a very impressive boy indeed. So next up, we're probably going to work on the Manticore because the Manticore is such an iconic model. I mean, to be honest, I feel like his Manticore is more likely to be recognized than Dieter himself because Dieter himself looks fairly generic. And as I mentioned before, there is another Necromancer mounted on a caparazon horse. That means a horse with cloth over it. That kind of doesn't look very, very different from him. Both of them are sculpted from the same base model, the same armature. So you kind of see the similarities between Dieter and his twin. But when it comes to the Manticore, there's nothing quite like the Manticore because it's such a bizarre beast. It's like if Simba basically had, well, a few grandparents short. So it's a slightly strange looking beast, but no less iconic for it, and I love it greatly. Funnily enough, people give Gary Morley a tough time for Dieter Helsnicht as a miniature as a whole, but the truth is, the Manticore was sculpted not by Gary Morley, but by Trish Carden. So, like if you ask me, I love his Manticore as if it were my own son. So I don't have an issue with the way he looks. If he looks a bit funky, well, to be honest, he just comes across as iconic for me. So I don't really have a problem with the miniature as a whole. I'm clearly painting it now, but yeah, it definitely looks one of a kind and slightly unusual, but all the more appealing to me for it. Your mileage may vary, but I find the derp is a big part of the charm, right? As we always say on this channel, you have to obey the derp. It's just part of the way these miniatures look and why they kind of look so adorable and benign and collectible. So we move on as we add additional highlights to the back banner. Sorry, I'm kind of like swinging around like crazy because this banner is so long that it doesn't quite fit under my camera rig. So in order to keep it in frame, I'm having to swing it from left to right. I hope that isn't too offending to your eyes, but it's the only way that I could really make sure I get these slightly fiddly highlights done from a relative distance. I'm also holding the brush from the extreme end of the shaft in order to be able to reach these areas on camera. So I hope you bear with me. We're almost done. So applying a lighter highlight, this time focusing on the raised areas of the skull. Of course, the raised parts of the dome deserve the most outstanding highlights. And then the ends of the femurs. Or femur, this looks like it could be one gigantic bone that's been threaded through. With practice and painting a painting a fourth edition Undead Army, you really get quite decent at creating a smooth finish on these large bones. And the way these large bones would look, because they occur in many places over this iconic army, including your Screaming Skull Catapult, including your Zombie Dragon, where there are bits of bone poking through the skin and so on, to Dieter, of course, who is iconic in and of himself. You get quite used to painting and highlighting bone. making it look fairly neat and clean because that complements the look of the army. And it's a fairly unique material for models to be constructed from, and are very specific to the 4th edition Undead Army. Therefore, getting good at painting these bones is essential. And hopefully you enjoy it along the way as well. Cool. So next, we need to move on to highlighting the ancient bone. But first, we're going to jump in with a bit of Black Templar to fill in the rope around his mouth. Now, before I started painting this, I double checked the miniature artwork as shown in the 4th edition Undead Army book, and indeed the model has black used to pick out these ropes. So yeah, it kind of still looks a little bit strange to me, but black is what they use, so black is what we shall use here as well. Again, I suspect this is a case of the painter having insufficient time, or maybe trying to fast game the process a little bit by working straight up from the black undercoat and completing the model by just quickly putting on a few highlights. But I actually don't mind the way it looks. I think it looks pretty good. I did consider doing this in either Nazdreg yellow or red, but I find that the black actually sort of keeps the color palette narrow, and the end result doesn't look too bad in my opinion. Cool. So grabbing a bit of silver, we're going to do this ring. So this is where the banner will attach later on. For the purposes of our videos, actually in general, I do enjoy making the banners out of a slightly tougher material than paper. So we'll be doing it out of plastic art. And then we'll be hand painting the design just the way it was intended back in the day. Because as I mentioned before, these models did not appear to have the banners available as stickers, at least not within the box set that I could see. Yeah, so fill in the center, and then the chains that hang down, and this weird sort of, it's a claw sort of medallion hanging. I don't know. I'm just going to do it all in gold because I think it would help it stand out from the bone. Incidentally, that was one of the reasons why I decided to do the backbone in this ancient bone color, because it would stand out more greatly against the silver and the gold, which I'm inevitably going to put on this chain. So I thought that would look like a better accompanying color. I guess we shall find out shortly. So I'm dropping in the silver, making sure we don't miss any points, and then leaving that to dry as we move on to another section of the model, as is our wont. And this is why I choose to show you painting in real time, because when you paint a miniature in real life, you'll be doing a lot of this stuff. This sort of moving from place to place on the miniature so that you give things adequate time to dry. It's just part and parcel of the painting process. And I just thought it would be more realistic to show you the way I do it. So a bit of grey. So finish off his pants. He's got a pair of comfortable baggy pants. So I imagine if your legs are going to be spread that wide, you want the most comfortable pants you can find. Also gives him a little bit of an exotic look, because this is a man who has been to the far corners of the earth. I imagine having a manticore to ride around does give you plenty of travel options. And this is a guy that maybe sometimes does his shopping in the far east of the Warhammer world. Or maybe that's where he got his manticore in the first place. Either way, a manticore is the equivalent of a private jet for any burgeoning necromancer. And as mentioned before, it's quite interesting because that means that as a living creature himself and with a living mount, um, Dieter can actually flee from combat, which can be useful if you don't want to be like pulped by a unit of Chaos Knights or similar. And if you need to beat a hasty retreat, as is often the case, it might be useful for your Necromancer to leg it rather than fight hand-to-hand combat with vengeful Empire Knights. Or even Karl Franz himself on his Griffin. Discretion being the better part of valor, that ability to flee actually what came in rather useful for undead players. Because fleeing means you might survive to fight another day. And with this guy being worth upwards of 700 points, basically making him about as expensive as Nagash himself, Dieter is not a model that you will want to lose in combat. Cool, so we are going to move on to some noun oil to shade down these. As usual, if your noun oil is not quite staining enough or not quite dark enough, you can just add a little bit of Black Legion to give it a little bit more oomph and shade down your models better. The current noun oil has its uses, but I miss the old one, so I still darken up mine just nice to give it a little bit of shading power and to make my silvers look more consistent across my collection as I transition from old noun oil to new noun oil. So fairly straightforward, applying noun oil over all these assorted chains. Hardly rocket science. Just be careful to make sure that you coat the chains from all angles in order to get the right effect. And we can use some of this actually to trim down some of our highlights as well, where they got a little bit overzealous before. There we go. Okay, so we're going to jump in and add a bit of gold. This is Nazdreg yellow plus Seraphim Sepia. This is our standard gold mix. And I find that applied over bright silver, it gives a pretty attractive result. In one quick coat, which you can then come in and shade and highlight as you will, but I quite like the way it looks just as is already. No additional steps needed. To be honest, I still feel like a lot of this is going to be covered by the banner, so there's going to be a little bit more adjustment once the banner goes on, so that will be its own separate video, but you can be sure that I will be applying additional shading and highlighting to this backbone section in order to make sure that the whole thing looks just right with the banner attached. So yeah, I think we are in a good place. I'm going to put on some additional highlights on the dome of his Staff of Flaming Death in order to make sure that it stands out properly. And little orange dots for each of his teeth. Paying special attention to the teeth that are in the center. For that three-dimensional look. And making sure that the red details on his sword his Chaos Rune Sword are proper bright and menacing. Like so. Okay. A little bit of red. To clean up around the edges. And I think we're ready to go. Okay guys, I hope you enjoyed watching me paint Medita. There is still a lot left to be done, of course. We need to finish up his back banner before we finish up his saddle. But I think for the most part, Medita's in a good place, and I hope he's been fun to watch paint as much as I've enjoyed painting this model. Alright guys, like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff if you enjoyed yourself. Peace, have a good one. See you again soon. Cheers. Bye bye.